Stephen Hilyard is an artist and professor of digital arts at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He was born in Britain, where he trained to be an architect. He subsequently supported himself by working as an architect while developing a career as an artist. After traveling and living in Africa for several years, he moved to San Francisco, where he continued to make art specializing in sculpture. During this time, he worked as a professional sculptor in a fine art bronze foundry before moving to Los Angeles to study at the University of Southern California. After receiving his MFA, he worked for 2 years for Peter Carlson and Company, a company that specializes in large-scale fine art fabrication, where he helped create work for Jeff Koons and Klaus Oldenburg. So do you do anything with Spoonbridge and Cherry, Minnesota's pride and joy?
No, we didn't make that one. We made lots of erasers. Mostly we were making for flying erasers.
Flying erasers. He's made flying. Who can say that's a
balloon dog?
Oh, and the balloon dog. As a design engineer for the company, he started working with digital drafting programs and 3D modeling applications. He began to use computers in his own art practice soon after this. From 1999 to 2004, he taught sculpture in 3D digital media at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. In 2004, he accepted his current position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he specializes in teaching 3D digital modeling and animation. Hilyard creates artwork in a wide range of media, both digital and traditional. His work has been exhibited internationally, including galleries in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, Minneapolis, Perth, Sydney, and London. That'd be a fun trip. We should go. Hilyard's practice has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Huntington Library, the Harpo Foundation, the American Scandinavian Foundation, the Ignite Foundation, the Wisconsin Arts Board, and the Minnesota State Arts Board. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Hilyard.
First, please, if you have any trouble hearing me, just at any point put your hand up and let me know I need to be louder or that I need to let my microphone up or something like that. So first, I'd like to say thanks to, thank you Heather, and thank you to everyone at the Minnesota Marine Art Museum for making the show possible and doing this wonderful installation. I don't think I've ever had my work in such a big room before. And particularly thanks to John Swanson, Director of Exhibitions, I think it's your title, for coming up with the idea for this and really making it happen. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of general themes of my work, which are common to every piece you will see here and most of the other pieces that I've done in the last 10 or 20 years. And then I'll talk specifically about the individual projects, starting with this one. So the kind of consistent theme of all of my artwork could be described as the profound. Various kinds of profound experiences that we lump together under this idea of a profound experience. And in this particular case, in the case of all the work that's here, that would be a type of experience that we call the sublime. And it is an idea that dates back to the 19th century. It's a relatively recent idea. That usage of the word dates back to the 19th century, and it's very often associated with wilderness and wild landscapes. So in the 19th century, when people were trying to come up with a way of analyzing our experience of aesthetic experience of art and of landscapes and the world around us, they came up with these categories: the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. And the sublime was considered to be the most intense of those experiences, and it was a kind of spiritual experience almost, of great intensity, a combination of joy and beauty and fear of the landscape that you were experiencing. And it was usually associated with landscapes. The kind of landscapes it was associated with were wilderness landscapes. So if you look in the, I think it's the American collection here, the gallery with the Bierstadt and the the church and the Hudson River paintings. Those are really good examples of the school of painting that was called, that's referred to as the Sublime Landscape, which originated in Europe with people like Turner, and came over here and became quite a well-accepted way of thinking about landscape. So it's a very kind of commonplace idea that everybody would accept now, that a wild landscape like the ones you would see in those paintings, or like these rocky mountainous scenes, or the waves on the ocean, those are places that we would go to find beauty, to find a spiritual experience of some kind, to find truth. Those ideas are very deeply embedded in our culture, and those are ones that most people would accept. They wouldn't think twice about it. In this country, we associate the American wilderness with ideas like liberty and truth and freedom. And we look at nature, and we look at wild nature particularly as a kind of model for how we should do things, whether it's your diet or the way you raise your children. We think, what did our ancestors do? What's the natural thing to do? What did the cavemen do? And even free market economics is basically the idea that the rules of nature will be the best way to manage things, we'll let things take their course. So we're used to this idea that wilderness and nature are some kind of ideal, and we can go there to get away from all of the things about our lives, civilization, that seem to be clogging us up. And we can go there and we can find something true or something profound. Well, as I said, this view of landscape is actually only about 150 years old or 200 years old. It dates back to the 19th century. If you had taken an educated person to the Alps, or to any one of these scenes, or to any of the scenes over in the American Gallery 300 years ago, they would have considered it to be ugly, and they would have considered it to be dangerous, and it was widely believed by many people that places like the Alps are proof of the work of Satan on earth, and the world would be a better place if we could flatten out all of the mountain ranges and straighten out all of the coasts. And then we would have the world back to the way it was at the time of the Garden of Eden, which was a perfect sphere. They called it the primordial egg, because that's geometric, right? And it's mathematical, and it's pure, so it makes sense that the world couldn't have been created as this mess. So people would have themselves blindfolded to travel through the Alps to avoid looking at the hideous scenes around them. So that interests me a lot, that these ideas that we take for granted, we assume are somehow eternal, like the fact that mountains are beautiful or that they are spiritual, are actually part of our culture. They're constructed amongst us, and they develop over time, over history, and they can change over time. And so the way we look at landscapes and our ideas about what is a profound experience are things that we have inherited from our culture. That's why I find that the way that I have approached the sublime as I've become a more mature artist has become less about trying to just go out and find it and capture it and pin it down. It's now more interesting to me to think about what I call the sublime impulse, which is, by that I mean the fact that we keep going, looking for this experience. We believe that we can go to these places and that we can find this kind of spiritual, intense experience. We can find answers to our problems. We can find the truth if we go to a mountain, if we go out into the ocean, if we go deep under the water. But I think that the sublime is of the category of, it's an ideal which can never actually be realized. So every time I've been to these kind of places looking for that kind of experience, it's never quite been that perfect, profound, ecstatic experience, because your feet are cold and wet, you're worried about how you're going to get down, the weather's coming in, you're worried about your nitrogen levels and your air supply, and there's a million things that get in the way of this profound experience, and yet you still go back the next time, and you still kind of believe that it could be achieved, just as another ideal, such as true love, in a kind of simple Disney kind of understanding of the term, is an ideal that maybe could never be realized, and yet we still believe in it, and we still go back to these places. And that's what I mean by the sublime impulse. And so that became more interesting to me than trying to come up with a formula to describe the sublime, or make the perfect painting or the perfect picture that would finally get it down the way people have been trying ever since Turner and the Romantics. So these pieces here are dedicated to 8 different individuals who all died for an idea. They died for the idea of the sublime. They were all mountaineers from the 70s and the 80s when I was growing up in England, and they were rock stars at that time. Mountaineering was a high-profile media pursuit, and so these figures like Pete Boardman, Dougal Haston, John Harlan, he was the only American amongst them, they were celebrities that everybody knew, and everybody knew about their exploits. And so all of these men, they were all men, they all died at the age of 32 or 33 in the mountains climbing. And if they had been born 100 years earlier, or 200 years earlier, they would never have been there. It would have been considered insanity to go to the Himalayas looking for forgiveness for your sins, as Dougal Haston did. He was the Keith Richards of the mountaineering world at the time, and was supposedly profoundly troubled by the fact that he killed a man in a drunk driving incident, and that's what drove him to extremes, or that's what they say. So he was the one that pushed it the furthest, but he certainly wasn't the only one that paid the ultimate price. So these were people that knew what they were doing, and they knew the mountain environment, they knew the risks involved, what mountaineers call the objective risks, the ones that you cannot do anything about, you just have to accept them in order to get to where you want to go. And so they knew that they were risking their lives, but they still went. And so why did they do that? Why would you do that? Just to have an experience for a few minutes on top of a mountain where you can barely breathe, having to wonder about if you can get back down again in one piece. They did it because of an idea, but it's an idea that wasn't just always lying around. It's an idea that was developed by the Romantics in the 19th century. So the sublime is an example of the way we construct the world in our minds, the way we construct it between us in our culture. So the way we see these landscapes and the things we project onto them, like spirituality, like purity, those are things that we have built. And to me, that's the most interesting part of it. And I think that's the way we experience everything in the world, is we build our idea of the world. And we can't, and we are limited in our experience of the world by the culture that we have inherited, by the things that it's possible for us to conceive of. So in all of this work, what I've created are landscapes which fit into the tradition of the Sublime Landscape. So you can find paintings in this building here of waves, and of mountains, and of waterfalls, and the traditions of the Sublime. I recreated those based on raw material that comes from the real world, but I've made them, but they're synthetic. They're constructed, and my goal is to leave just enough clues to the fact that they're not real, to the fact that this thing isn't just a simple document of the world, that this is actually something that's been constructed, it's been idealized, it's been made too perfect, just the way that the sublime is an ideal that is too perfect to maybe ever be truly 100% experienced, just like all the other ideals are too perfect to really exist in the world. So in some cases, there's symmetry in the images, which is clearly synthetic. In some cases, I force the images into rigid structures of composition, like the landscape piece over there of the glacier. Everything's laid out according to the building section. So I moved around the various elements of the glacier to make it almost symmetrical and to make it fit into this structure, just the way a painter would do when he's painting a landscape. He'll move things around so he gets the little thirds just right, or he gets the balance. So the reason I went to make landscapes underwater in Iceland, which is where how these were created, was that I wanted landscapes that fitted this sublime tradition, the gorges and the canyons that Turner would have painted in the Alps. But I wanted lighting that would make it look kind of artificial, like it was a model, that there's something slightly wrong about the light. And so I went to great lengths to get that lighting, and it took, the project was probably 4 years in gestation before I even got to Iceland. It originated in warm water, diving on the Great Barrier Reef and the Ningaloo Reef of Australia, where I noticed that the effects of the water were similar to the traditions of landscape painting, the aerial perspective, atmospheric perspective, where each range of hills gets a little grayer, a little less saturated. And the water has a similar effect, but it's more exaggerated. So I had the idea of making landscapes underwater, but hiding the fact that it was underwater. And I started a search for locations. So initially I thought I would be going to some lovely coral reef somewhere in the Pacific, where there was 100-meter viz that all the other divers would. So divers are always swapping information about dive sites and where's the newly discovered place and that kind of stuff. And this went on for a year or more, and people started mentioning to me on the internet that, you know, the clearest water in the world is the coldest water in the world, so Antarctica or something like that. And I eventually stumbled across this location on the cover of, I think it was Time magazine, or one of those magazines, had an article on the 7 Wonders of Europe, and there was a single image on the cover and then one small image inside of this canyon. It was basically that view, I think, or a similar view to this one, with a diver just floating in the middle of it. And that's when I realized that I wasn't going to get to go to a coral reef, that I was going to have to go somewhere where the water was only 1 degree above being ice, and I was going to have to learn how to dive in cold water. Luckily for me, at the time I was living around a lot of cold water in Madison. And I was able to do all the dry suit training and get comfortable with comfortable enough with the dry suit that I could stop thinking about it and think about photography instead. I spent probably 2 years on the training and the preparation, writing grants, getting funds, all that kind of stuff. All based on a hunch that it would look the way I wanted it to, because I'd only seen 2 pictures of this place. And then eventually we got it all together and we flew to Iceland for a month, just me and my girlfriend, now wife. And we waited a week for a bright sunny day. I gave $500 to a dive master, and we went and did a couple of dives there. And I took hundreds of pictures, got them back, and took a look at them and realized they were all completely unusable. It was the water's so clear that on a sunny day, it's either blown out white or black. It's like being on the moon. It's so bright down there that you can't take good pictures. So I had to wait another week and go on a rainy day to find it looking like this, looking like the kind of lighting that I was hoping it would look like, that I had a hunch about. And I inserted the figures because that is one of the ingredients of the landscape, of the Sublime Landscape tradition. If you look at the paintings of any of these people associated with the Sublime, like J.M.W. Turner or Stout Church, those kind of people. There's always a small figure in the foreground to give a sense of scale. So an important part of the Sublime is the idea that we are tiny, insignificant figures in the face of this enormous universe or this enormous landscape. And that's part of the spiritual dimension of the Sublime, is that it's a sense of something larger than ourselves. So I followed that tradition. In fact, I even copied a specific figure from a specific painting called Wanderer Above the Clouds by Caspar David Friedrich, and I posed the mountaineer in the same pose as the figure in that painting. So the mountaineers are all me, wearing vintage, correct 1970s mountaineering equipment, some of which I still owned, some of which I found on eBay, some of which I faked. And they're all me in my studio in Madison, Wisconsin, hanging about 1 foot off the ground from the rafters, for instance. And they've all been inserted into these landscapes. The major clue as to the underwater nature of these landscapes was the underside of the water, which was like mercury, the way it always is when you're diving. So that was removed and replaced with clouds, which I photographed elsewhere in Iceland. And that was enough to remove most of the clues as to the fact that this was underwater, but not all of them, I hope. So what I'm going for is some sense that something is slightly wrong, but it's not really clear what. And that's really true of all of this work. So if we look at the waves back there, they're perfectly symmetrical on the outer edges. But so they were made by taking a single image and flipping it to make a kind of what they call it, book fold symmetry, like you would see with wood veneer. But that line down the middle where you see the perfect symmetry has been completely reworked to take away the symmetry there. And they've also been reworked quite a bit to make them more dramatic and a little bit more threatening. But I left the clues on the edge to the fact that we're actually looking at the same wave twice and flipped. They were worked deliberately, digitally, to make them feel like paintings, to make them feel a bit like landscape paintings of a mountain, for instance. You've got the green hump, you've got the grey sky and the white in the foreground. The smaller images mimic those colors, they mimic the layout, but they are not dramatic and profound and sublime like the waves. They're kind of sad and pathetic. And that's why they're small, too. The smaller images are shot at a couple of different cemeteries in the Forest Lawn Cemetery System in Southern California. I don't know if anyone here from Southern California? Big hand up for Los Angeles. Well, there's a chain of these, in particular these two were in Glendale and Burbank, which are kind of like the Disneyland of cemeteries. And so they have a lot of art collections and reproductions of Michelangelo's David and things like that. And they're kind of park-like, but they don't have any kind of headstones or grave markers or anything like that. So it's a bit like a golf course with dead people. And then there's just little plaques in the grass that tell you that somebody's buried there. It's broken up into different regions, which all have their names, much like other cemeteries, I imagine. But the only markers for those different parts of the graveyard are the names of the parts which are printed in the gutter, the way you would house numbers. So, and this actually shows up on the street maps of Los Angeles. I discovered this by looking at my Thomas guide, which is like the old paper road map that you would use to get around, and seeing this whole network of streets called things like Rest Haven and Blessed Rest and Babyland, which is where they bury the babies. And it's very bizarre and very kind of sad. And so these images are paired because the wave is the image of the kind of sublime nature and the place where you go and you take risks. So a key to a lot of this mountaineering, surfing, diving, particularly free diving, which I was reading a lot about, where people dive as deep as they can without scuba gear, just holding their breath. And there's a real glamour to all of this. There's a glamour to this risk-taking, there's a glamour to the people that cheat death. And, but at the same time, death is the most common, banal, ordinary thing in the world. And it's not profound, and it's not glamorous when it's your boyfriend or husband who wipes out on the wave and doesn't come back. And it ends up in places like Forest Lawn, coming up with phrases like Sunset Slope to try and ease the pain, or to try and make this make sense. So I'm pairing the big dramatic wave with the sad kind of gutter label in each of these images. And there's actually 5 in that series. Let's see, how am I doing for time? The waterfall was actually shot during the same trip to Iceland, and that was just a lucky find. And I filmed the waterfall originally thinking that I just wanted the waterfall itself without the people. And I filmed it for 20 minutes waiting for them to go away. And they just kept coming, and some left and other ones came. And so I was grinding my teeth, and then I eventually got about 5 minutes without any people there. And then I brought it home. And then once I started watching it, I realized that the point of that piece was the people. So these are people that have spent thousands of dollars, many thousands of dollars, traveled from all over the world to Iceland as tourists to come and stand in front of this waterfall. Why are they doing that? Why would you spend all that money to go and stand in front of a waterfall and point your camera at it and move around and constantly try and find the perfect photograph? Or why would you go all that way and stand in front of it and hold your arms out, which everybody does, to have their picture taken? He did it for the same reasons that these guys died, because of the idea that these places are beautiful, they are profound, that we should go to them, they have value. And again, that's the idea that's only been around for a few hundred years. So I thought there was something really heroic about these people, although they might seem a bit silly, kind of wandering around with their cameras. And my hero there is just standing there waiting for the perfect picture to just happen. Holds her camera, her phone up, and then she holds it up again. So the sublime impulse, my view of it is that although it's always kind of doomed to fail, it's also one of the most heroic parts of being human, is that we still believe in these things, even when they don't work out. So the tourists are the pilgrims, and they've come to this place, and when they get there, they don't really know what to do. And I guess they don't find the sublime. But they made their best effort. And the ending didn't actually really happen. The waterfall wasn't really that perfect. It's been flipped to make it symmetrical, but it's out of the flipped half is displaced in time, so it's not completely identical. And the sequence of events with the pilgrim that's in the foreground is being manipulated a little bit to create the climax at the end, where the hero photographs the man in the crucifixion pose. And then the glacier image was, it's the first finished piece from the recent work I've been doing in the Arctic and Svalbard. So there's a number of projects in the works based on 2 different trips that I did up to the high Arctic. And in this case, it's again a classic subject for a sublime landscape image that has been manipulated to make it fit into a structure. And the structure is visible, the fine lines that are on top of the image there to show the golden section grid that's been created, to give a sense of this being some kind of mystical, magical alignment that was found in the glacier, even though it wasn't. So I think that's about it for my explanation and my little walkthrough of how these things came to be. Anyone have any questions? Yes. Yes. In the bigger sense, she asked, does it take a long time to get the pictures perfect? And yes, all of these did take a long time, but for very different reasons. So in this case, there was a lot of time in preparation, just training to be able to go down in water that cold and be able to take usable photographs. As much work as went into the video of the waterfall, for instance. Because there I had to trace around every one of those figures for every frame that they were in to paste them in front of the waterfall. So I know every single camera strap and every fold and every sleeve. So there's probably thousands of hours of work there, just to so that you don't notice that anything's been done. Yes?
Is the scale of the human figure accurate to the background?
No, they are actually smaller than they would be if you saw an actual diver there. So they've been made a little smaller to exaggerate the scale. So I think, looking at this one here, he's probably about half the size of true scale. And so all of these images have a little bit of, they're exaggerated in that way. The waves have been made a little taller. I had another series of mountain images which have been stretched slightly to... so this is what a painter would do. He would take what he sees and he idealizes it. He makes it more of what he wants or expects. And if you look at those sublime landscape paintings there, like this one actually painted from very near here, John was just telling me, you go up to the actual location, you realize the bluffs aren't that tall. That's what has always been done. So I'm doing that very consciously. Yes?
Two questions. Number one, how deep were you when you took most of these pictures? And two, were there no marine creatures that made their way into these photographs?
Yeah. The first question was, how deep was I? The geological structures here are created by the plates of the Earth's crust pulling apart. Europe and America are pulling, I believe they're pulling apart, not coming together. And Iceland is basically the volcanic eruption that's on that seam. And so you find these cracks all through Iceland. And the cracks are constantly growing and changing. And so you've got these cracks which are filled up with boulders to varying depths. And in some cases the boulders are filled all the way up to the surface and there's actually dry land, and so the canyon is blocked. In some cases the water was 2 or 3 feet deep, and in other cases it was 60 feet was the deepest we went. But those boulders have spaces between them, so you can actually swim into gaps between the boulders, which is essentially cave diving. And those have been followed down 200 or 300 feet by cave divers. I did a couple of short sections of cave diving here from one section to another. And the second question was about marine life. Basically, there isn't any, not that you could see, unless you were a very meticulous scientist who went searching for, there is one kind of stickleback in that lake somewhere apparently. The water here is incredibly clear for one reason, because it's so cold. It's just about freezing. And it's been filtered through a lava flow for about 10 years. It takes 10 years to get from the glacier where it melts to these cracks. So by the time it's been through this filter, it's completely pure. And so the only thing that grows there is this algae slime, which you see here, which is quite fragile and does get knocked off as you pass through, particularly in the shallow sections. But that's really the only life that's there. So it's the opposite of a coral reef in that regard.
Question?
Yeah.
I'm a little slow. Maybe this is fresh water then?
Yes, fresh water, yeah.
Okay.
And in general, anyone that's done any diving, usually fresh water has got a lot less wildlife in it.
Yeah, when you said stickleback, well, that's fresh water.
Yeah.
The waterfall picture, right first off, where's all that water going? There isn't a lake or pond or whatever. Is there a canyon that goes down?
Well, actually, there was a lake in the floor. There's a lake between the figures and the waterfall that you can't see because there's a slight hill. But you can actually see a tiny bit of it in the corners. And then it runs, there's a river that runs around the side, so that off to the left side there is actually a river. and at one point my hero fell in it. And I originally had, as I say, 20 minutes of this slowed down, so there's 40 minutes of footage. I wanted to make this 40 minutes long, but I just couldn't do that much work. So I wanted to include her falling in the river and the kids running around and all this stuff. Yeah.
What kind of editing software are you using?
Basically, I'm a hostage of Adobe Corporation, so Photoshop is used for the imaging work. The video work is done in After Effects. Primarily, I'll be working with Premiere a bit more. And then I also, there's no examples of it here, but I do 3D modeling and animation as well. That's the main thing I teach, so I use Maya to create completely synthetic elements. Bees flying through the scene, birds flying, leaves blowing. Yes?
I'm curious about your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
They're photographs.
Yes.
But they're backlit.
Yes.
Is it more like a slide technique?
It's exactly like a slide. It's very similar material in there to a slide, to an old-fashioned slide. It's called a light jet print, which is a photographic material, traditional photographic material, either paper or in this case a color reversal film, which is like a slide, exposed by a laser from a digital file instead of from a negative. So the actual material itself is the same as traditional color photography. It uses the same chemicals and all that kind of stuff, but it's exposed digitally. That is then sandwiched between clear plexi and white plexi, and then there's just fluorescent tubes behind there. So this is exactly what you would see in a movie theater.
So you printed on this film in case.
Yes, it's just sitting between two layers of plexiglass, and that's done commercially. So the machines that do that are, the size of this square of chairs here. They're huge, expensive. But yeah, one of these prints, it's about $500 just for the print. Yes? No, although I'm glad you think it might be. No, it's not a tornado in the background. It's just some clouds from Iceland. They have a lot of clouds in Iceland. And so I was taking skies all the time that I was there. And I think all of them do originate from Iceland. Although that wasn't really a rule that I set for myself. Yeah?
The rocks or the landscapes themselves, are they more or less accurate?
Yes, yes. Some of them have been altered a little more than others. So in this one, for instance, you can see this really obvious symmetry here. And I inserted a few small elements here and there. This one is probably the least changed. I think I added this rock here just for compositional reasons. The rest of it is completely as I saw it, except for the sky. So it varies. And that one there is really hasn't been changed at all, except for the stuff in the foreground that was put there to frame it. These are in a series. The idea is that they start kind of on the surface in the brightest, openest area, and the figure is moving into this canyon. He's going down into the cracks. He's going deeper and deeper. He's sailing or rappelling, as you would say over here, until eventually he gets to the lowest level. So it's really kind of a journey to the land of the dead kind of idea. Yeah.
Camera and lens?
It was a Canon EOS 1DS, which was the biggest DSLR at the time, walking 16 megapixels, and it was the Canon 1740 zoom I think I was using, and it was basically wide open. It was so dark on that rainy day that I had the aperture wide open, and I was shooting at the slowest speed I could without getting any blur. And so they were all underexposed. So it was they were very noisy images. It was a lot of work to clean them up. And,
what length lens again?
It's a 1740 zoom lens. I think it's one of their L series lenses. And not the sharpest lens in the world, but when you're shooting through in an underwater housing, the front of the housing is like a giant lens in itself, so it's always a bit soft at the edges anyway. So this isn't somewhere you go trying to find perfectly sharp images. I've done work since then with large format film cameras that is really sharp, and I love that, but you can't have everything, so. Particularly underwater.
That's an idea.
That's an idea. Oh, very good. Someone's paying attention. Yeah, John.
Steve, could you just speak briefly about the soundtrack that you chose for the waterfall video?
Well, the soundtrack for the waterfall I created. It's actually constructed from recordings of 10-year-old boys during their piano lessons, which is why it's a little less than perfect, but it has great ambition. They're playing the kind of romantic, the classic romantic canon of piano pieces. I originally was just inspired. I got the idea from hearing my niece trying to play Fur-Elise in a very staccato way. She had each phrase figured out, and she would get rearranged and then do the next 3 notes. And so I thought that was going to be the soundtrack, and I went to record at a local piano teacher, and I was hoping they'd do some Fur-Elise, and they did at one point. But these kids got so into it, and they wanted to show off all their chops, and in the end I used a lot of it, including the 2001 music at the end, which was just perfect. So again, it's people attempting to achieve the profound, but failing, but attempting heroically and cheerfully. In that case. Yes? Well, this location is a tourist destination, like the waterfall in Iceland. So there is a company of maybe 4 people who are, it's a dive company that will take people on dives. And they go to other places in Iceland, but this is probably their most prominent place. And so they had a dive master. I was basically paying for the time of a dive master who is a highly trained, experienced diver who also knows the area very well. And so he was my guide. And, but you can go there, and anyone can actually go there and snorkel along these canyons. And that's one of the trips that this company does. So they get you in a dry suit, they give you a snorkel, and you paddle along on the surface. And you will see, you'll see all this stuff from the surface as a snorkel. You'll be up at the top instead of down here, but it's still pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing just looking over the edge when you're standing on the edge, because the water's so clear you can see all of this.
What kind of a time frame did you shoot these pictures in? 2 hours?
Yeah, we did 2 dives. Each one was about 40 minutes long before your brain just starts to freeze. So these were all shot over the course of about an hour and 20 minutes. And yeah, so the original day that I went out with the owner of the company, who was a very experienced, careful diver, none of those images were usable, but he took me to most of these places, but he didn't take me to the first one there. When I went the second time, he sent me out with a 19-year-old guy who was one of his trainees, who wasn't so worried about all this kind of safety nonsense. So he took me to that place, which turned out to be the beginning image of the series, but it's actually at the very mouth of all of these canyons. They come down to the lake and they join up, and then they finally exit into the lake at this point here. So what you're seeing here is a big bank of sand that comes up to within, the water's maybe 5 feet deep there. And all of these canyons are coming in, and all of the really mild, slight currents in each canyon are being funneled over this through 5 feet of water here, and it's 60 feet here. So once you get over that rise, which the original guy wouldn't let me do, suddenly there's a raging current, which you don't really notice as you're floating along with it, but when you're trying to get back, suddenly you're not going anywhere. So that image down there was taken from basically with the open lake behind us. And to get back, we had to basically crawl hand over hand across the bottom. It was, because the current was so strong. And then he took me through the caves, which the other guy wouldn't do either, which I wasn't really trained for, but it was pretty dramatic. So yeah, that ultimately it came down to just 80 minutes after about 4 years of preparation to get what I needed.
Did you take a lot of things that are not used in this?
Well, I took several hundred shots, so there were a few that didn't make it here, but I did have more of an idea of what I wanted because I'd been there once already.
Yeah.
So I knew the basic locations I wanted to go to. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff on the editing room floor, there always is. And there's many projects that never even see the light of day, they just get cancelled at some point.
Question.
Yeah.
So with all your seeking the sublime, have you had a personal experience where you tried to seek something in nature, or were you a mountaineer or a free diver, like all this cheating death? Does this come from like a personal interest?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's...
What is your extreme sport?
Well, it started out with rock climbing, mountaineering. When I grew up in Sheffield, which is the rock climbing capital of Europe, by which I mean it has the most climbers of any city in Europe, because it's a big city. It's close to some of the best short rock climbing in Europe, and they had the dole, so you could be on the dole and climb. So I grew up. I happened to be in the center of climbing, and so I naturally kind of fell into rock climbing as a teenager in high school. And I only really got, diving was something that I took up. I got certified because I was going to Australia to visit my sister. That wasn't until many years later, and after 10 years of living in California and never quite getting around to it, right next to the Pacific, I ended up getting certified in a muddy lake and a golf course in Duluth, Minnesota. so carpe diem, people. So those are the main things that I've done. I've been going to the Arctic these last 2 trips, and so there it's more a case of polar bear self-defense, as they call it. So.
Well, this has been so fun. Can